Welcome to Heritage Collections Management 2022. It's great to see so many of you online from across the world. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to David Lipsey. David, over to you.
Tom and all of the Henry Stewart team, thanks so much. I'd like to welcome everyone to Heritage Collections Management 2022. With our subhead of New Goals, New Solutions, we think consistently about broadening, diversifying, and including not only new solutions and new technologies, but an ever-widening circle of professionals and diversity and inclusion in key goals towards that. Over these past few months, we've been working together with Nik Honeysett, who's going to be very capably guiding us through our day today. Nik, it's always been a pleasure. It's a pleasure to work with you. It's been a delight to have some more time together, if only it involved airplanes instead of just cameras. We'll get there. Yeah, to that exactly. Thanks so much for your help with this, and welcome all. Here's Nik.
Thank you, David. It is a pleasure to be here. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome back if you attended the DAMS Day yesterday, or welcome today to the inaugural 2022 Heritage Collections Management Conference from Henry Stewart DAMS, which I am privileged to be chairing. We have a stunning international program today. I'd like to thank all the attendees for joining us. Also a big thank you to our sponsors who ensure events like these can happen, and please show your appreciation by visiting them throughout the conference via the exhibitions tab. Before I give you a couple of housekeeping notes, please take a moment to reflect on why you are here today and what your big questions and even your small questions may be. I'd encourage you to post them now in the Q&A panel so you can provide some guidance for our stellar speakers who I will introduce to you momentarily. I guarantee you will not regret this session or attending the entire day. For the day, during all of the sessions, please chat with your fellow attendees and of course, post comments, questions using the QA panel, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. You can also use the chat tab, which is that blue button to get conversations going, or you can navigate to the lounge tab. Lots of opportunities for you to participate in real-time networking with your peers, and we have a fantastic attendee list here today. If at any point you during the event you need assistance from the Henry Stewart team, you've probably seen that chat bot in the bottom right of the screen, that blue button. Please use that to connect with them. I have one small announcement, which is Henry Stewart is delighted to announce the return of in-person. Yes, David, we can drink together again. The return of in-person events for the DAM and Creative Operations community, which will be in London next month and New York after that, with the safety of attendees, speakers, and sponsors as a top priority. We're excited to be raising the glass in person very soon. Now, the real reason you're here to discuss what is one of the most important topics, not only facing cultural heritage collections, but our society at large today. I'm delighted and honored to introduce our keynote speakers. Omar Eaton-Martinez, who has a 9-to-5 job with the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, but more importantly is of the Museum J.E.D.I, spectacular name, Justice, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Marijke Everts of Europeana. And they're here today to discuss best practices in delivering diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. First off, I'm going to ask Omar to talk to us, discuss what he's doing and some of his philosophies, and then we'll hand over to Marijke. As I said, please post questions in the chat and make sure you get what you've come here to receive. So Omar, over to you.
Well, thank you, Nik, for the introduction, and thank you to David and the Henry Stewart Events. And I'm really happy to be here with the Heritage Collections Management audience today. Again, my name is Omar Eaton-Martinez, and one of the things I wanted to kind of start off with in terms of talking about diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion is the idea and the premise that museums are a colonial project. That is the foundation, that's the foundational truth of these organizations and entities that some of us work for and serve and work alongside with. And I mention that because the idea of doing diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion is really to push back against that colonial project in every which way that you can think of. So when we talk about historicizing the legacy of what that means, we have to understand how it started and how things started to change over the course of time. I'm going to try to be brief because I'm really eager to hear your questions and be in conversation with you instead of speaking at you. But I did want to share a few things about my thoughts about the history of it. And one of the things is that there's sort of two ways to look at how organizations have responded to this colonial project. One of them is to really come up with these conceptual ideas around diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion, and when responsibly done, really incorporating that throughout their museum operations. So, of course, with our collections, but also with our interpretation, our education, our workplace culture, how we go out and engage communities from a place of equity and not of paternalism and things like that. Then the other way, which is really I think what happened sort of towards the beginning of this effort, is really building your own institution, right? So that's where you see, at least in the United States, I can speak to it with a little bit more specificity, the start of Black museums and tribal museums, and now you see more Latinx museums and other culturally specific museums that have continued to pop up, and more are popping up every day because there's value in building your own institution. One of the things that we really were able to draw from those who were able to participate in the morning keynote yesterday from Martha Diaz, a good friend, is the awesome opportunity it is to be able to start a museum from the beginning and take all these things into account and then deconstruct the colonial project and reconstruct it into something much more equitable, much more powerful. And so you have those are sort of the two ways that I look at it. You can work sort of within the hegemony and put these concepts in place through diversity, accessibility, equity, and inclusion. But then you can also rebuke that entire structure and build your own, right? So what are some good examples of how that looks like in past history? Well, I think a great marker is looking at how we sort of historicize the beginning of what is now called the National Museum of African American History and Culture under the Smithsonian. A lot of scholars go back into the time when the African American veterans of the Civil War were seeking to memorialize their efforts and their participation in the Civil War. And they were looking to seek to create a memorial, which would be a museum, and they were going to march on a parade, and it actually made it to Congress, but it never was accepted in the Congress. It was never legislated into existence. And this was back in probably 1915 or something closer to that part of the early part of the 20th century till now, in 2016, when the actual National Museum of African American History and Culture was established on the Mall and opened its doors to the public. But in between that time, a lot happened. And another great marker, I would say, in the United States in particular, and maybe globally, were the 60s, where there was a lot of change, a lot of social justice movements, a lot of protests. You have organizations like the original Rainbow Coalition, which existed of like the Black Panther Party and the Young Lords, and in certain iterations, the Brown Berets represented the Chicano movement and the West Coast, and I Work UN, which represents the Asian American movement and the American Indian movement. All those movements happening at the same time, really rebuking the hegemony at every step. When that's where you see Black studies rising and ethnic studies rising and these museums coming out. And some of the examples would be museums in particular. I would focus a little bit on some of the major cities like in New York, where you had the Studio Museum in Harlem was established. You had El Museo del Barrio was established around those times. And these were like after a lot of protests from some of the major museums like the Whitney and the MoMA and the Guggenheim. And in that protest was birthed these new institutions. At the Smithsonian, there was also something that was birthed because of what was happening in particular around the Poor People's Campaign, where they had what we call Resurrection City. So this is the original Occupy movement, way back in the 60s that happened there on the National Mall, which is probably the most gazed at piece of real estate as it pertains to Washington, D.C. and museums in D.C. And during that time, you had a secretary, Secretary Ripley, who saw an opportunity. There were a lot of museums at the time who were scared to open their doors because of all the different people. So for those who aren't familiar with the Poor People's Campaign, it was another coalition across racial ethnicities that came together, including poor white people, to talk about poverty in the United States. And it was originally led by Dr. King, who unfortunately was assassinated before he saw it into fruition, and later led by Ralph Abernathy. And so there was a lot of people of color in different poor communities who were down on the mall who aren't the usual occupants of that space. And so there were some people that were scared and uneasy because they weren't familiar with that crowd. And instead of closing the doors, that Dillon Ripley decided to keep the doors open. And in that process and that sort of interrogation of doing something different, then there was a sort of a hunger for more African American and community-based museumship happening, was the Smithsonian Anacostia Neighborhood Museum that is now called the Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum. And so the original director, John Kennard, who was a young man in his 30s, he was not a museum specialist, he was not a PhD. He was an activist, right? And what activists do that are different than some of our more traditional profiles in museum spaces is that they see a gap and they stand in it and they address it. And they saw fit to address this need of really uplifting the culture and the history of Black folks in our country, in particular in the Anacostia neighborhood, which has been a historically Black community for many years in Washington, D.C., to really historicize and really bring light to that culture and the things that are happening in it. And the same with the Studio Museum, and the same with the Museo del Barrio, and even the same with the National Museum of Mexican Art in Chicago, who again was started by Carlos Toledo, who was a Chicano teacher. He was a teacher who saw this, and a teacher activist who saw this gap, that he didn't see himself in museums, he didn't see his community represented in museums, and decided to address it. So it's one of those interesting queries because, again, I started off this talk with acknowledging that museums are a colonial project, but even those on the margins have seen fit in ways to disrupt that in a way to recreate it for their own purpose. Now, the last part I'll talk about, and I'm eager to hear from you all some questions. So hopefully you are putting those questions in the question section of our virtual session here, but is to really look at diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion as a framework that can evolve into a social justice framework. So the limitations of diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion, if you talk to a lot of thought leaders, is it still riffs off of white hegemony or dominant culture hegemony. What social justice frameworks would like to do aspirationally, and in some cases, you may actually see this in certain institutions, is they're destroying all the barriers. They're removing all the barriers. So when you have DEAI, those are really concepts and tools to work within the barriers and try to get that equity and try to be inclusive and try to change those things. But when you're in a social justice framework, you've removed those barriers and you've created something new. And so I think aspirationally, looking at building institutions, looking at revamping existing institutions that might have had a hegemonic past, into really thinking about social justice frameworks where these barriers are removed. It could look like things like, some of the things I've seen come up were co-directorships. You start to see people, not just really lifting up the governance of museums through their boards, where you just have people who are on their boards because they can financially support, but also having people on the boards who represent the community's needs, who represent the community's thoughts, who are thought leaders and scholars, and lifting up their voice in the same way you would someone who could cut that check for you. Or even looking at sort of a bicameral type of situation where you might have fundraisers on one board and then an advisory council in another entity, but still finding a process and a way of living and being with one another, where both of those houses have equal voice in how we govern and move forward as an organization. And when you start to remove those barriers, it looks completely different. And it's very disruptive into what we're used to thinking, even to the people that want to make it that way. And that's why I always look at our work as iterative. It is something that's always in development. And if we understand keenly that this work never ends, then it's easier for us to make friends with that. And it's easier for us to move the work forward so that we can advance to social justice and remove all barriers to really do the work that the community needs through our museums. And so with that, I'll leave you with those thoughts, and I'm happy to entertain any questions and excited to hear from my colleague, Marijke.
So thank you so much, Omar. So a lot of people saying hello and greetings from across the world. Does anybody have any immediate questions for Omar? I mean, I like just to while you gather your thoughts, just to, you know, as you were talking, Omar, and previously before you were talking about kind of building your own institution. I mean, are we, as you have all these cultural heritage professionals on the line, I'm a big fan of Malcolm Gladwell. You know, to get a movement going, you know, you start small movements first and then you figure out how to organize those things. Are there things that you don't see happening in cultural heritage institutions, given maybe things aren't happening fast enough, but are there kind of more governance or kind of maybe operational type things that institutions could be doing to kind of keep building this movement?
Well, you know, one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately is, you know, the fundraising aspect, you know, the idea of decolonizing fundraising, decolonizing wealth in that way. And, you know, thinking about the great work of Edgardo Villanueva, who's put out the book and has spoken a lot about these different issues. And I'm thinking about, you know, one of my favorite radio stations is part of this network called the Pacifica Network. And in DC, it's WPFW. And one of the things that they pride themselves on is they don't take any corporate sponsorship. And again, it's not necessarily to say anything that all corporations are evil or anything in that nature in particular. But I think what it does do is it allows them to have an active membership who's constantly given and really having the voice of the community there and not necessarily having to be beholden to any one entity on the basis of their economic status. And I think that's really, really powerful, especially in our country where we're capitalists, and so there's a lot of ways for people who are rich to influence the narrative. And if we really want to have a social justice framework, we really want to be equitable and inclusive, then we have to start thinking about different forms of fundraising in that way. I mean, I think it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to wipe out corporate sponsorships, but I think diversifying our portfolio in terms of our fundraising is really key.
Okay, thank you for that. And that does address one of the questions in the Q&A. I think it's a good time to go over to you, Marijke. All yours.
Thank you. And thank you again for having me here. And Omar, that was really inspiring what you said, especially around social justice and the fact that this is work that obviously is continuous and never ending. And that's something, of course, that has also been a huge thing for us at Europeana. So just to quickly mention for those who might not know, Europeana, we our website of more than 1 million cultural heritage objects from collections across Europe and also outside of Europe as well. And specifically in the team that I work in, the collections engagement team, we reuse these cultural heritage objects to make online exhibitions, galleries, and blogs as well. And we work with various organizations work on projects as well with these with this content, and get in more content, and also work on projects that we call short projects that we call seasons. For example, Black History Month, the European version that we had in October, and also Women's History Month that's coming up. So in terms of diversity, inclusion, accessibility, and equity, we created a cross team for diversity that I co-chair with one of my colleagues, Yolan, and we also have another cross team on accessibility as well. And I'll talk about both as much as I can, and specifically around on both sides, we have members from across our organization who take part in these cross teams, because we feel it's important to have these representatives in order to be able to share the knowledge and experience that we work on, and to be able to kind of have a back and forth with the rest of the team. So we're reaching common goals across the organization, and it's not just one specific team who's working on diversity or accessibility, but we acknowledge that it needs to be across the whole organization. So basically, we tackled obviously a lot of different areas in this. And one of the important things that we thought was important to tackle, and also something that Omar, you as well mentioned, was how do we create, diversity inclusion, also in the form of creating a place for staff as well. And one of that was working with a diversity inclusion consultant, because we are not experts ourselves in this department, and we also want to make sure that we're following some good guidelines as well. And one of that was also having workshops around creating a environment that is welcoming for all, a safe as possible environment for staff, and also during our events that we host throughout the year as well, that we make sure that we have the tools to create a safe environment. And so we've been working on some inclusive engagement guidelines. It's work that's ongoing, and of course is never going to stop, because you do need to continue to look back at it and see how you can create continue to make the guidelines also more accessible and more representative of the society we live in as well. And so one of the ways we're also doing that, and haven't yet, that's coming up, is working with testing groups for these guidelines, and making sure we reach as many diverse communities as possible through these testing groups, so that they can look at our guidelines and see if they feel, represented in these guidelines. So that's one aspect of things that we found extremely important to do. The other aspect is through, as I work in the collections engagement team, and we work specifically with editorials, is diversifying our editorials. And I'll say 3 years ago, a lot of the materials that we were producing editorial-wise was very much focused on white narratives, and something that when I joined the team, I wanted to feel represented. And that's something, again, that I found back in what you were saying, Omar, is just wanting to see people like me in the editorials that we produce. And that's something that I started doing. And we realized as well that, okay, we need to actually have something in place where we say we are, we find this important and we're going to do more around this. And one aspect was also that we recently did and made official was a Black History Month in October, which I was leading, where we worked with different organizations across Europe who also hold Black cultural heritage materials in their organization. And also we worked for the first time on a Black history exhibition, so-called Black Lives in Europe, and specifically wanting to focus on Black stories across Europe, because that's something that we felt has been lacking For us, a lot of the content that we also have on Europeana really focuses, the little content we have on Europeana focuses a lot on American Black history as well. And we've found that we don't know that much about our, our own Black history in Europe. And so that was something that we thought, okay, we really need to get onto, highlighting more of this, not just to diversify our editorials, but also for people like me as well, to learn more about my own history in Europe that I don't know that much about, to be honest. And we also decided to hire a sensitivity reviewer to look through our exhibition, because we, within the team, we are composed mostly of people that don't share that lived experience. And we want to make sure that we are as respectful as possible in the way that we write about these historical figures. And so that's something that we thought was important, and something that we feel that we should continue to do, and not just in terms of Black history, but all other communities that we want to write about as well. And also the intersectional side of things, because we are not all made up of just one identity. You are, I'm a Black woman. I could also have, there are people out there who are, Black with disabilities, who also, happen to be gay. And we kind of stories that are out there, and more of the, people who exist instead of just a small portion and small boxes of people, because we're all of multiple identities as well. And a nice example of that was also our Olympics Heroes exhibition that just came out today, and that also represents a nice range of diverse sports people, and also of multitude of intersectional identities as well. Something that we also wanted to do was also have support people in writing for us as well, because again, we don't represent all the groups of people that we want to highlight in our editorials. And we also want to be able to support them in writing for us, and also specifically marginalized, underrepresented groups of people through a grants program as well. And something that also came up in especially working on this Black History Month season was the fact that some of our content is problematic on Europeana. It has offensive terminologies, and how we want to address it at this point was also making sure that we have content warnings in place, especially if we want to use an editorial piece, a specific piece of artwork that in itself isn't specifically having an issue, but the title is quite problematic. And to make sure you have a content warning in there and provide context around why this is an issue, and things like that as well. But that goes to show that there's also more to do, because we do have a huge range of content on Europeana that has problematic terminologies, offensive imageries as well. And this is where our diversity and inclusion aggregators working group comes in place. And they're the ones who also bring in the content from cultural heritage organizations into our website. And they're tackling how to create guidelines for the terminologies that are around these types of content. How do we deal with the sensitive content, and also bringing in communities who are directly impacted by this content to work with us on providing better terminologies and better guidelines on how this is displayed as well. And that's something that we found is important, is that you can't just work on this stuff that doesn't directly impact you. You need to involve the people that are impacted by what's their cultural heritage as well. And a nice example of working with communities at this point is this project that's been ongoing called the Weave Project. where it works directly with the Roma, the European Roma Institute for Art and Culture. And at the moment, there's going to be an event from February to March directly related to workshops around working with marginalized communities, creating guidelines as well around handling intangible heritage as well, because that's also part of it. And this WEAVE project is something that we also want to see grow within the rest of Europeana. So working directly from bringing this with the Roma community, bringing in their cultural heritage, objects on Europeana in the way they want it to be seen and showcased on Europeana, with, you know, the context around it that they want, the rights, licenses that they want, instead of us having content from minoritized and marginalized communities that have not been that these communities have not had much of a say on. So there's quite a lot of range of things. And the other aspect is also accessibility, which we've been working on with the accessibility cross team, and throughout the what we've been doing is working with experts in accessibility to view our website and see how we can improve it in ways. And that's constantly ongoing work. Something that we also do is use alt text now as well with our editorials to make sure that our editorials are more accessible to people with disabilities, and also having making sure that our events are also accessible with subtitles. And also, once we have the recordings, that we provide transcripts of the recordings as well on our professional website as well. So there's a whole range of things and things that we continue to try and improve on. And as Omar said, it's work that you do continue to have to work over, and you can't, you know, there's no stopping. We always need to improve. The world keeps changing and we need to adapt with it as well. So this is kind of what I wanted to talk about briefly.
And so I actually have a question for you, Marijke. So a couple of in the chat, there's a couple of questions, and I think this is to both of you around. So, you know, you're doing this work. It's, you know, you're achieving, you're making progress. But I think stepping back a bit and saying, how did that start? Particularly, there's some upvoted question about, you know, junior staff. How can they get this kind of ball rolling? How can they pressure maybe either the curatorial staff or the administration? And then I think, how do we pressure administration to adopt this, you know, these initiatives and in a meaningful way, rather than just, you know, a courtesy? So do you have advice about how can junior staff get going on this?
So is a question for both Omar and
I would say, you know, I think in the remaining few minutes, what's the real practical advice that we can give attendees to actually take away and go to their institution tomorrow and start putting something into effect?
Okay. So I can just quickly say how we went about this as well, because for us, it was also, let's say, a bottom-up approach. We saw there was an issue. There wasn't much diversity in our organization, in the editorials we were producing as well, at the events that we were hosting, and we realized that we were all kind of thinking the same thing, but no one was talking to each other. And it took one of us to really go to different departments and say, hey, you know, I think that we lack diversity in our editorials and we need more diverse editorials, and you're the department that deals with that. How do we make this happen? Oh, you're the department that deals with the event. We need more. And being able to kind of gather these different groups of people together into a team, if you can, a cross team, we were able to do that, and then have these conversations together. So gather as many people within your organization to start this discussion. And I think from there, it can start going upward and, you know, reach higher grounds where they start to realize, okay, this is important work. But this is from the experience that that we've had in my organization.
How about you,
think,
Omar?
I would say a couple things. I mean, one of my favorite stories that address this issue is what happened in the Smithsonian, probably late 80s to early 90s, where we have affinity groups in the Smithsonian that are culturally specific. And one of them is the Latino Working Committee, which I had the privilege of being a co-chair when I was there. And what they did in the 80s was they saw that there was the 500th anniversary of the Spanish conquest, and they had a big thing at the Smithsonian. And so the Latinos that were there saw an opportunity to address the lack of Latinidad within the institution. So they started to gather the issues together. They brought it forth to some of the leadership at the time and really didn't get the response that they wanted. And so what they did was, well, they got angry, number one. So there's a little bit of passion involved in activism, right? And within that passion, they were able to really strategically recruit and enroll other external entities around them in what's happening, right? And so I think one of the mistakes that we make is that we try to do this internal movement, and if it goes to the top and it gets rebuked, that's sort of like we kind of leave with our heads hanging low, and that's not where we stop. I mean, if we're doing this work that's community engaged and we're engaging external stakeholders, then we have to lift up their voice. Well, we can't lift up their voice if they're not informed. And so they brought in other external agencies who are very influential, and were able to inform them of what was happening. And then those agencies, by proxy, were able to then go to the Smithsonian leadership and we're able to address these issues. And what happened as a result over the years? I'll say this quickly because I know our time is short, but they have the Smithsonian Latino Center, which is still in existence today. They had a Latino Initiatives Pool, which has now grown to over $1 million a year that they give out internally to different programs within the Smithsonian to advance Latinidad. They had the Latino Working Committee grew even more. The idea of, there was a report that was created called Willful Neglect, which really audited the institution for its lack of Latinidad. And suggestions like the ones that I've already shared with you, like the Smithsonian Latino Center, but also the eventual, having an eventual national museum for the American Latino, which now was signed into existence about a year ago, and now is preparing itself to build its staff and to create this museum. So all that to say is that if you're going to have a movement, you have to be collective, you have to have strategic partnerships, you have to be able to be collaborative in your effort and not hang your head low the first time you get rebuked. The other issue I would just say is that, like, because of what we have right now with social media and technology, there's a lot of movement across the field where people are getting together and not necessarily beholden to just their colleagues in their immediate institution. I've been part of movements like Museums and Race, which started in 2016. We have Mass Action, Museums as a Site for Social Action, that was underwritten by the Minneapolis Institute of Art, a 3-year project, which came up with a toolkit to talk about this type of interrogations. And Museum Workers Speak. We have Museum Hue. There's many organizations that none of us were working in the same organization for the most part. We were all spread out through all types of museums, whether it was culturally specific, predominantly white, children's history, art. It was just a whole aggregate of people, and we were able to link around common issues. And so I think because you don't have the same barriers people did 20, 25 years ago, you have plenty of opportunity to continue to build those coalitions.
That's great. Thank you, Omar. And we have a minute left, which is a shame. This is a fantastic conversation. So if I could just kind of summarize, I think actually Gerald Jones said, courage and persistence, keep at it. If you turned away once, just use that to come back even stronger. Share what you're doing, talk about it, have these open conversations, connect with professionals. Omar just mentioned a bunch of organizations for whom this is their mission and their passion. Connect with those. Don't try and do this yourself. I think particularly either as an individual or as an institution, get the professionals who know how to move these initiatives forward. I have one last request, Omar, which is you mentioned a book earlier on. Could you tell us again the author and the title?
I don't remember, to be
Okay.
honest with you, Nick. But we
So-
can talk about it later and send it out through the
Okay,
dance portal.
through
I'm
the
happy
chat.
to do that. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, again, this was too short a time, but a fantastic conversation. Omar, thank you so much. Marijke, thank you so much. There's some links in the chat to some of the work that Europeana is doing. And I will just suggest the next session is about building readiness into the Carnegie Hall's digital collections. Please go to the community feed to have a chat. And once again, a really big thank you to our keynote speakers, Omar Eaton-Martinez and Marijke Everts. See you at the next session. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.